Today I'm going to talk about the role of international transportation sectors in climate stabilisation. And being a bit cheeky really, I've managed to sneak my way on here because my research is looking at stabilisation at 2 degrees C. So I don't know how I've managed to sneak my way on today, but I did. But we can link it to looking at a world of 4 degrees above, because as we've heard already today, if we're looking at limiting emissions to 450 ppm, a lot of people have already started saying, well, that's not going to be enough to limit the temperature at 2 degrees C. We're looking more to 350 as being a much more likely case. It's not looking like we're going to be able to achieve that if we carry on at the current rate of emissions. So my work, although it is looking at 2 degrees C stabilisation, chances are it's going to be looking at a world with a higher temperature degree. So basically what I'm doing is looking at emissions under climate stabilisations based on current projections on the SRES type assumptions. I'm looking at aviation and shipping's been brought into this today as well, and then hopefully see what the impact of this industries will be on with the current growth expectations in a 2 degree world. So quickly, first looking at aviation and shipping, obviously there's a strong historical growth and a projected growth. We all know about aviation, we all hear all the stories about it and whether we want to change our lifestyles. Shipping quite often goes underneath the radar, but it is quite interesting to think that about 80% of world trade happens via the shipping sector. I mean, if everybody looks in their wardrobe or looks around their house, a lot of their stuff, their clothes will come via, shipping. So it's something that very much has kind of managed to stay below the radar, but it's going to hopefully be, much more in the forefront of things to come. Both aviation and shipping are not covered by the Kyoto Protocol, although under Article 2.2 of the protocol, it did say that you should pursue limitation or reductions of emissions, but as is always the case when something's not binding, that doesn't really turn out to be the case. So although they're not covered under the Kyoto Protocol, aviation will be in the European Union's emissions trading scheme phase 3 from 2012. Shipping is not included in that phase. However, there has been talk that if there's nothing meaningful comes out of Copenhagen in December, then maybe it will be considered for future rounds of emissions trading. Both sectors are dealt with within their own specialist UN agencies, so there's already the structure there to deal with big international policies to do with this. And it's really important to note that these two sectors do have complex non-CO2 effects on the atmosphere. I won't actually be going into any detail with these. I will just be looking purely at CO2 because that's what all the policies are aimed towards. However, it is important just to show you this quickly. This is the radiative effects of aviation, 2005. If you look at the far right column there, that is level of scientific uncertainty, which demonstrates to you really why carbon dioxide is really the only one that gets most of the attention, because there is a real high level of understanding of its cause and effects. Whereas you look at the other ones, like especially in the aviation field, contrail cirrus is a really big issue, but there is still a level of uncertainty here, which is why we tend to look, I will be looking at carbon dioxide. Quickly looking at the radiative effects of shipping, interesting to note that there's both positive and negative impacts from its emissions. Currently, shipping has a negative forcing effect. However, there are policies which are reducing the sulfurs and sulfate aerosols. These are the ones which have the negative impact upon the temperature. So if we keep reducing those, and obviously with carbon dioxide having considerably higher lifetime, atmospheric lifetime, then eventually shipping will have a positive forcing effect. So both of these sectors aren't just about CO2, there's a lot of other things there as well. They're currently not really there's no kind of policies in place with them at the moment. So just quickly looking at stabilisation, as we've seen earlier, it's the ultimate goal of the UNFCCC, basically stabilising greenhouse concentrations at a level that will prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference of the climate system. And basically, stabilization requires an eventual and sustained reduction of emissions to a level subsequently below current levels. There are a number of, there's a couple of stabilization scenarios already out there. The IPCC Working Group 1 first developed some in 1994. And then there's the WRE ones, which I will be focusing on, which I'll just show you here. This is Wigley, Richels, and Edmonds, who based their stabilization profiles on the IPCC's Working Group 1s, but with a different pathway to stabilization. And basically, this just shows you the CO2 concentration here on the left, and you can just see there's eventual stabilization of atmospheric CO2 concentration, which varies depending on your pathway. So if you look at the 450, that stabilizes at around 2065 compared to the 350, which stabilizes a lot later at around 2140. Looking at that in terms of emissions response, this is where it gets a little bit more interesting, because you can see if we're looking at a 450 and 350 parts per million, especially at 350, if that's what we need to look at in terms of limiting our temperatures at 2 degrees C, that is going to require negative emissions. It says negative emissions there at 2065, but that's only 15 years later than the current policy's end level at the moment. So it's really interesting to see that in terms of actual emissions response, it's going to need quite a dramatic reduction in emissions. So I've just put those there today just to show you, if you're not aware of what stabilization, what kind of profiles they are, this is kind of what we mean when we're looking at them. So, quickly to look at the historical trends of aviation and shipping. First off here we have got total fossil fuel CO2 on the left, and we have aviation and shipping CO2 on the right. So we've got two different axes here, just to make you aware of that. And then obviously along the bottom we've got from 1940 to 2005. 1940 we used as the main starting year, because that's what's considered to be when significant aviation started. And as you expect, you've got increasing trend in aviation emissions up to 2005. Let's add shipping onto that as well. And again, it's quite interesting. If you look at the main interesting part of the shipping one, is in about 1980 to 1985, which is when shipping industry kind of changed the way it worked to containerization, where container ships were used. So there's a bigger increase in shipping. So that just shows you how there's this increasing trend, basically, of both sectors' emissions. So let's look to the future. Here you can see aviation emissions. This is based on the SRES storylines. So when you see A1, A2, B1, B2, that's based upon the SRES storylines that we've heard about already. And it just demonstrates how there is an increasing, obviously increasing emissions from the sector all the way up to 2050. I've done to 2050, but I have actually, the reason I've done that is because that's where policies end. But if you want to see my 2100 slides, I have lots of them as well. So we just can see, depending on which storyline you go for, there is a difference in the emissions that the aviation sector will create. Compare that to shipping emissions. When we look at the shipping emissions, we have a number of different, there's not just A1, A2, etc. We have A1B, which is like the A1 before, A1F, which is fossil fuel intensive, A1T is the technology focused. So there again, we have a similar outlook here of increasing shipping emissions up to 2050. So now just looking to the modelling methodology that I have used within this study. Basically, I've used simplified climate modelling. So I've used got the background CO2 concentrations from the MAGIC model, which is a simple climate model. Then I have used LinClim, which is a simple linear climate model, to basically input in the CO2 concentrations into that. So I've used the IPCC's third assessment report's RF methodology. And that gives me, when I run that through the linear climate model, it gives me a temperature response as well as radiator forcing and concentrations of aviation and shipping individually, so the marginal response of that particular part of the sectors. So what are the results? So here I have plotted the emissions profiles, the stabilization scenarios of 450 and 350 at the top, compared to the aviation emissions there. Sorry, I've got a bit of a frog in my throat. So it's quite interesting to see that if we look at, this just goes down to 2050, and if we remember the previous slides for the 350 parts per million, that went into negative emissions. Now this is inconsistent really with what aviation is projected to do, as it's projected to increase. So if aviation sector is increasing its emissions and we're supposed to be at some point having negative emissions, then obviously there's an incompatibility there with these two scenarios. Looking at percentage emissions for aviation compared to the scenario as a whole, in the share up to 2000, so that would be 1942 2000, the share of aviation's emissions was 2.1%. Now, if we look at what that percentage will be when we reach 2050, this is for 350 parts per million, obviously depending on which storyline you go for. So A1, it will take up to 32% of total emissions at 2050, going down to B2, which is 19% of total emissions. We look at the 450 scenario, it's smaller, but again, we're still looking at 12% total emissions taken up by just the A1 storyline. And now you might be thinking, oh, this isn't too bad, but you've got to remember, this is an important thing to remember, that this is just aviation. This is one part of one sector. So we need to think about all the sectors that will be contributing to this, the emissions under stabilisation. So this is just one small part of this, which obviously will have serious implications. We looked again to shipping. Again, we can see an increasing pathway of emissions, dependent upon which storyline you go for, against the stabilisation scenarios. And again, it's a similar, shows that obviously it's taken up a considerable amount of the pathway. Again, the share of historical emissions to 2000 was 3.6%. And again, if we look, it's even bigger than aviation, that we have nearly 50% in some storylines being taken up by, the proportion being taken up by the sector under a 350 pathway, and from between 18 and 12% when we're looking at a 450 pathway. So this is a really interesting thing to know, and if we put that together as a whole, aviation and shipping, which are just two elements of a transport sector, under a 450 stabilisation, we take the two extremes. A1 will take up 80% of total emissions. B2 will take 51%. Under a 350 ppm, it will be 20% and 19%. So, although I'm just looking at that, it looks like it's the other way around, isn't it? Yeah, sorry. So ignore it's flip them over basically. So 450 would be 20 and 19, 350 would be 80 and 51%. So it's really quite a scary outlook if you think about it, thinking this is just one small part of one sector. This is where I ran it through a link limb to look at the RF and temperature response. We can see that shipping has a greater RF response compared to aviation. That's due to the fact that it has been around for much longer, so it's got a longer legacy. When we look at total forcing, again, like I've just done with emissions, aviation, its total forcing is about 3 to 4%. Shipping is 5 to 6%. Looking at the temperature response from these two sectors, on the left you have the temperature response of aviation under 450, which obviously is increasing up to 2050. And this is just, remember, just a current policy end dates. So we think this is increasing here. That's thinking if we're going to look much further, what if this is going to increase up, what will the implications be past 2050? Okay. And then there's shipping, obviously, which again has an even bigger temperature response. Quickly, again, just looking at this under a 350 ppm, 4 to 5% of total forcing under aviation 5 to 6% of total forcing under stabilisation. And again, just to the temperature response, which again shows just an increasing temperature from these two sectors. So what are the main conclusions that we need to take home? Well, first, I have to make it known that this is a mix of two world outlooks. We're looking at a stabilisation pathway compared to an SRES scenario pathway. So we're kind of mixing two together. But really the important thing is that it is a first look at, sorry, I should say aviation and shipping there. A first look at aviation and shipping under stabilisation, seeing whether it will be compatible. But most importantly, it is really important to provide some feedback of the future expectations to the both sectors. The aviation sector I know it's going to Copenhagen with some position papers to say what they feel they need to do. And we need to have these studies which they can look at and understand exactly what their future might be. Where to next? Well, we've just looked at two little parts of the transport sector. Obviously, road is even bigger, so it'd be interesting to see if we look at that within that as well. And also, how exactly are we to break down the stabilisation as a whole to allocation levels? It's all very well talking about this is what needs to be done, we need to limit temperatures, we need to limit concentrations, blah, blah, blah. But what exactly does that mean for each individual sector, and how are we going to put this all together as a whole at the end of the day? Thank you very much.